Counter-Narrative News, bringing you daily news today on Friday, the 3rd of March 2023. The President of France, Emmanuel Macron, is on a tour of Africa visiting 4 nation states. He is on a very defensive rhetoric while speaking on his tour, because he's strategically responding to the manner in which former French colonies in Africa have switched their global allegiances to Russia and Russia's racist death squad, the Wagner Group, as they've become frustrated, on the one hand, with what they claim is France's failure to combat terrorism in these countries, which they've hitherto been in a partnership with in trying to push back on violent armed gangs. It remains to be seen if Wagner, in its own modus operandi of conducting brutal massacres of whole villages in its pursuit and in partnership with certain African states, can actually achieve anything better than the French military neo-colonial presence in Africa. President of France, Macron, is arguing that the French neo-colonial military presence is going to be no longer, and it's going to be more a framework of somehow kind of building education and training. This is very much a manipulative comment, because of course French neo-colonial military presence in Africa will continue unabated. Indeed, France still has troops in countries of Chad, Niger, Gabon, Senegal and Ivory Coast, pointing to the ongoing problematics of neo-colonial interference and exploitation and oppression and manipulation of the continent, but also a similar framework, in some ways even more vicious and naked in its viciousness, emerging from the so-called new poles in the world, particularly that of the Russian leadership, which is presenting a trashier, more toxic version of Western neo-colonial domination. Going over to Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon, there has been reports of which we're not sure that they're reliable. Nonetheless, there have been reports that Russia is recruiting Palestinians from refugee camps in Lebanon and then deploying them as mercenaries in its own neocon imperialist war of invasion, occupation, collective punishment and annexation in Ukraine. If this is true, and we're going to check with our reliable contacts within Palestine and the Palestinian community, if this is true, then it really points to a very low and dirty collapse of ethics around the Russian project and conflict imposed upon Ukraine. How can you recruit some of the most poorest, most most oppressed communities from a refugee camp that's not even in their own country, and then deploy them into a project similar to the Tel Aviv project in Palestine, but in Ukraine? It just beggars belief, and really people should stay vigilant and oppose such a development for the interests of the oppressed working classes impacted there. It was on this day 2 years ago that tragically a young woman in South London, in Clapham, was kidnapped by a London Metropolitan special police officer who had a special duty, was an armed officer and a special duty to protect the US Embassy. He used his police ID to kidnap Sarah Everard off the streets and raped and killed her. That did spark a momentary moment of resistance against police brutality, but that soon fizzled out. And more recently, Darren Carrick, who's been prosecuted as the most prolific sexual abuse and offender and sex abuse offender of women, who's also a London Metropolitan Police officer, has been exposed. And then that also points to a bigger growing, burgeoning scandal within police forces across the island, that more than 1 in 100 officially have been implicated in criminality. That's 1 in 100 police officers officially implicated in criminality themselves, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. So the police force is riven with criminality by police officers themselves. This really should spark mass grassroots uprisings and protest movements. Frankly, every police station should be under siege in a struggle for justice and exposing this criminality by the police, but Britain still remains half asleep and dominated by a political hegemony that pushes the whole population in a far-right and growingly viciously racist direction. Also, on the 2nd of March, back in the 70s, Muammar Gaddafi, the leader of the Libyan socialist Pan-Arab and Pan-African revolution, released his theory of the Green Book. It's a combination, basically, of of kind of socialistic principles inspired by socialist principles from the Quran and Islam, and some elements of kind of peasant-based economy and petty bourgeois economy, imposing it upon the socio-economic system that was the Libyan Arab Jamahiriya. It's an interesting document. Its reflection in what was the 41 years of socialist Libya was a really interesting one, because it really presented to the Libyan people a form of socialism that was quite flexible in accordance to their own culture and political sensibilities, but pushing the entire nation and people definitively in the direction of socialist liberation, women's liberation, and black liberation. It's a very interesting document, and we would encourage everyone to read it. It's not without its contradictions, as the Jamahiriya and Gaddafi himself was not without his contradictions, not least the contradictions of a type of Arab nationalism that leans way too heavily into Eurocentric forms of nationalism, and even right-wing, even far-right nationalisms that's been in part internalized by many Arab nationalist circles and other problematics. Nevertheless, it still is a generally very positive contribution to the experiments and experiences of Global South colonized people seeking resistance and liberation, and frameworks to redistribute wealth and power amongst the oppressed and labouring classes. Counter-Narrative News thanks all of our followers. Please do continue to encourage your contacts and friends to subscribe to our YouTube channel and to follow us on Twitter at counter_CNN. We wish you a fantastic weekend and a Jummah Mubarak, a happy Friday to everyone.